Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. This season, we're having sweaty conversations for change. We're talking with guests about uncomfortable conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion needed to pivot towards positive change. We do this podcast because it's important that all voices are heard, all people are seen, and all people feel a sense of belonging in their workplaces. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome back to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm so excited to be joined by Shanti Bright Brien. She's an author, criminal defense attorney, and co-founder of Fogbreak Justice, a national organization that collaborates with criminal justice professionals, civic leaders, and business change makers who are serious about fairness, equity, and inclusion. She's also published a book, Almost Innocent: From Searching to Saved in America's Criminal Justice System, which is an inside account of the messy and tragic criminal system, and offers suggestions for what it could be more fair, more humane, and just. I love that. She also has shared human experience for profound change. She received her BA with high honors and distinction in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley and a JD from Stanford Law School. And she's also an enrolled member of the Muskogee Creek tribe and a mother of three. Oh my gosh, Shanti, thanks so much for your work and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here.
Well, it's fun to have you, and knowing the work you do with criminal justice and the core of systemic racism and just so many of the challenges our country still faces. I'm curious, what stories have you collected along your journey in diversity, equity, and inclusion? In particular, a time when maybe a light bulb went off for you, or you had to have a candid conversation about this topic, or you just flat out, I'm sure, have seen so many injustices. I'd love to get our listeners started with a window into your world.
Yeah, sure. I spent many years as a criminal defense attorney on the appellate level. And one thing that translates into DEI work is I was representing a pretty young guy, Scott. I'll just call him Scott for today. And in appellate work, we dig through the record and we look at every little detail. And I make my assessment, of course, because I have the education and the experience and the credentials. And I make my assessment about what issues I think should be raised on appeal. What are the really meaty, good issues, the potential issues that will win? And we had somewhat of a disagreement, Scott and I, because he really was insisting on one issue. He said that was the winning issue. And we went back and forth, and ultimately it is my decision. But ultimately it was his issue that came out to be the right issue, and that we actually did succeed in the appeal. And the takeaway from that is, in the criminal justice field, in criminal defense, we're sort of famous for our kind of savior complex, and that's reinforced by this power differential, right? I have the degrees and the experience, but the lesson really is that it's the people going through it's the people with the day-to-day lived experience that have something to teach. Well, Scott had something to teach me, and that I wasn't listening to his needs enough. I wasn't valuing his perspective enough. In the end, it worked out, but it did teach me something about humility and listening and really being open to the ideas of the people most impacted by these systems of oppression. So that's just one takeaway.
Well, and it's so easy, like you said, to fall into that pit of saviorism, save the day, let's put our rescue cape on, especially, you were in a position of power, like you said, and you had the expertise and education to back up your thought process. But making sure folks that are already, being thrown into a system that's not fair, that we're listening to them when they're in that system as well. I'm curious, I want to unpack. I mean, this is such an incredible topic because criminal justice, we talked about on the podcast, but we have more corporate leaders, DEI practitioners, that kind of thing. So you really come at us from like a really unique perspective. And I want to dive into that more. You know, you think about the roots of systemic racism, and I couldn't think of a better example than the criminal justice system. Can you give our listeners that may not have that whole history and understanding of just how challenging our system is, especially for people of color, especially for people that are already underrepresented in our system as a whole? Like, how did we get here?
Well, and this is something we, at my organization, Fogbreak Justice, we think it's so important to really recognize the historical context of our current situation. I mean, especially in criminal justice, but that's true for all of us too. So, slavery, how we got here. It's slavery. I mean, I would also say the sort of systematic oppression of Native America. I am a member of the Muskogee tribe. So, I think it's profoundly important to think about how the wealth of our nation was built on taking land from Native tribes. I think we can't move on until we've really recognized that shared history. And then in terms of criminal justice, we went from slavery to Jim Crow. I mean, police departments, I think, as a lot of people know, were really like slave patrols. I mean, that's how police departments started. I think then we moved, from Jim Crow. It took us a while, but then really criminal laws, and particularly the war on drugs, I mean, some would say was a system of racial oppression. I mean, the new Jim Crow, the book by Michelle Alexander, it's been on the New York Times bestseller list for like 300 months or something. So it's not 300 months, a long time. Yeah, maybe that long, a long time. She provides a very detailed, well-researched, well-documented history of how the criminal justice system really is a system of racial oppression, how it really, the intent of it was to continue those systems. So it's well beyond one podcast and well beyond one answer to one question, but there is a long history of the intersection of racial injustice and criminal justice system.
Yeah, not exactly the one that's taught in our history books either,
Right.
which is really problematic because you can't solve a problem that you're not fully aware of the origin of that problem and how long it's been around. And I think a lot of people that aren't affected by these systems might think, slavery was over 150 years ago, right? Like, why is this still an issue? And, you really did help us see, like, Jim Crow, policing early on. That was one thing that I did not know until recently, that the modern day police, when they were first formed, was very much to maintain segregation and to reinforce and just small behaviors like standing outside was not allowed, like sundown laws in the South. So very much, if you think about the origins of policing and where we're at today, it's no surprise that it's also very segregated and not a system that works for everyone. I'm curious, Shanti, like, knowing your own history and knowing, the experiences you've had with clients in the system, what are some things that you believe, if shifted, if changed, we could start to get to some of the roots of the issue? What would be some things you'd want to see prioritized to help change the system?
You're talking about criminal justice in particular? Well, I usually think of it in sort of two buckets. And one is making the system much, much smaller. The other is to make the system much more fair. So the second bucket is pretty related to DEI work. The first bucket is maybe more policy changes in terms of reducing the amount of just over sentencing. So 3 strikes laws would just be one example, but we are very much addicted to over sentencing, I would call it. So a sentence of 28 years, 87 years. I had one client that had 3 life sentences plus 30 years. So it's almost ridiculous. What does that even mean? And if you think about yourself going to jail or prison for 2 weeks, a month, 6 weeks, that really puts in perspective a sentence like 87 years. So that would be one way to make the system smaller, is to really reduce the sentences. Also, cash bail reform, that's a big issue right now. That actually would make a big difference in the number of people pleading guilty and entering the system. Decriminalizing drugs. The war on drugs is still absolutely and totally going on. There's 1 million arrests per year for drug possession still happening. So that's the first bucket, make it smaller. The second bucket, make it more fair, which is really related to a lot of what your listeners, I think, are doing. And to do that, I think we have to really come to terms with the unconscious and implicit bias that is really baked into a lot of the decision-making at every level. So that this is true for organizations. It's particularly true in criminal justice. So like at every level of the process of interacting with the criminal justice system, in every level of the process of hiring, retaining, promoting people, those implicit biases sort of compound on each other. And so, to make systems more fair, we have to address those like at every level. That's just one way we can do that. I mean, having a lot of education around the history of race, racism, white supremacy for everyone involved in the system or organization, I think is also something that could make it more fair. Just a lot more awareness about the systems and organizations we're moving and working in. For example, we had slavery in this country for much longer than we have not had slavery, right? So to have an awareness around that is really sometimes can shift people's ideas of what we're living and working in.
I love sharing that statistic too. 250. Well, you could say way more than that, but at least documented here in the North America, it was 250 years, right? And we're only 150. So really, we've had it a lot longer than we haven't. And the origins of all of our systems, voting, education, food, access to food. I mean, criminal justice, like all of these systems, all of them are rooted in a mentality of less than and dehumanization. So of course, it makes sense that these systems aren't working for those folks still. And I really like your point about self-education too. I think for allies and training, those listening, we've mentioned a lot of these resources, but like 13th, I thought was not a perfect documentary, but it does give you a great historical perspective and just the numbers of incarcerations and how they've gone up exponentially, like you said, with war on drugs, and in particular from the 1970s to now. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. Like it wasn't that crime increased. It was that the way we managed it changed. So, and there's some great books. You mentioned The New Jim Crow. I love the book Cast. There's some great tools that people can read to really understand how these systems came to be, because that's how we have to dismantle them. Now, shifting gears a bit, thinking about listeners that might be doing DEI work or in organizations that aren't a part of the criminal justice system. I think one of the things I hear most often is like systemic change is like really hard. It's really long. I'm just one person. My organization doesn't want us to get political, just all these excuses. But I think thinking about from an organizational perspective, if someone's sitting in human resource or anywhere in the organization, how would they be supportive individually of helping address some of the systemic changes that are needed in the criminal justice system? Like, what do you think organizations could do more of to be supportive?
Well, as I've already said, education. I think that that's a great starting place for people who want to do more but don't know what to do.
Sure.
And I think books, book clubs, discussion groups. Let's just do our own work, learn more before we try to, make changes out there. So I
Right.
would say that's a great place to start is learning more. The second thing I would say is listening. More listening, so less like less savior complex. Like I'm in charge of DEI and I'm going to go fix everything and we're going to be the most diverse, most inclusive organization. Like let's just start with listening. So at
Mm-hmm.
Fogbreak, we always start all of our big projects with really extensive information gathering, data collection, interviews, talking to people. What's happening in your organization? Because, like all my clients had their own stories and their own insights. Everyone working in organizations and every organization has their own challenges. So, really doing a lot of listening. We have this idea of seeking out nestled voices. So,
Mm.
as a leader, as a DEI leader, you might have an open door policy. Come talk to me anytime, share problems, share struggles. But there's people out there that have such valuable insights, and they're having really profound challenges in your organization, and they aren't empowered for whatever reason to come to you. They're not comfortable coming to you. They're not comfortable sharing with you or the CEO what's really happening. So to seek them out, to say, do you have something to share? Because there's a lot of valuable insights that are nestled out there that if we could be better listeners, we would then know the path to making our organizations better.
Yeah.
So, for example, like we had one client we were working with, it turned out like women in leadership roles was a major problem. And, we went in thinking, about race mostly, like racial equity being a problem. And really, it turned out they really needed a lot of support and sort of scaffolding around like gender. And so that's one example.
Yeah, it's like if you go
But
into the situation thinking you already know the answer or you know what the problem is before you even figure out what the problem is. I remember that was one of the things I learned in business school of all places. I remember I had a professor that would say, "So do you know what the problem is yet?" No? Well, then keep working on the problem. Stop coming up with all these ideas until you know what the problem is and like clearly define that problem. We do listening sessions too. My team does. And it's some of my favorite work. It's some of the most painful and taxing work because listening is actually a lot harder than it sounds. Like just listening, not coming up with your own opinions, testing your own assumptions, judging people. It is listening. And I agree with you. It's amazing how we'll go in with as open a mind as we can, kind of laser in on an issue. Just kind of how our brains work is just to get to it, right? And just staying in that curiosity mode, just staying curious a little longer until you've really heard the real issues. Because so many of these issues have so many root causes and tentacles to them, right? Like we wouldn't be in this situation if it was an easy problem to solve. And I know that's something that you really bring as far as thinking of allyship and how to be an ally. It's really a very similar mindset I have about meeting people where they're at, right? It's not about me and how I want to help. It's more about them and what do they need. So I'm curious, did you think about allyship and helping people really back to your story of really listening and working with people working through issues? What tips could you offer, or what ways have you seen allyship work in your own career, in your organization, or with your clients?
Well, maybe I'm being repetitive, I guess, but like you said, meet people where they are. So that's just about, again, listening, being open, um, not getting defensive or, yeah, not thinking I have the right answers. So I think, yeah, really being open, listening, finding the nestled voices, stepping back from problem solving, like you said, find the problems. And sometimes it's surprising, right? Sometimes it's you don't know that the problem is going to arise. So, for example, a client, we were talking to a lot of people, interviewing a lot of people in different departments of the organization, and then we finally found the nestled voice who said, "There's an issue here with just like foul language and yelling. And it really seems to impact this group more than this group. And like it's really harmful." And we just were a little bit blown away because this is a professional organization. They're super dedicated to equity work. And to think that, you know, this issue, which maybe some people thought wasn't an equity issue, really came out as more like a work culture or a like environmental issue, just as almost abusive. So like we were so surprised that that came out, and it took us a lot of digging and listening to get people to trust us to say that. So maybe that's another thing, is like really letting your clients or your employees or whoever you're working with, letting them know you're kind of in for the long haul and that you really are open to hearing the truth. I think that creates a lot of trust so that people will open up to you about what's really going on.
Yeah. Yeah, they might be thinking, like, does she really want to hear all this? Right. Like, what are they really going to do with this information? So if you show,
Yeah.
like, we're in this for the long game, like, this is not a quick fix. We're not looking for band-aids. And that's when you hear like the real, like, what's really going on. But people
Yeah.
have to build trust. And, especially for those of us who show up as external consultants, right? It takes time to build that kind of trust because you're an outsider. I mean, you're not somebody that people know maybe well. And so they have to really see that and see it through your actions, see it through the things you say, the things you do, and reinforced over time to build that trust. So it does take some time to get to the real issues. I love that, Shanti.
Yeah. On that point, I guess I want to add that, I think I learned this from your podcast, actually, to be really transparent, to be really talking a lot to your employees or to the organization you're working with about what you are doing, like really regularly reporting back on, like, we are still in this, we're still working on it, last month we did this, we're doing this next month, we're still open to hearing from you, like really doing like a lot of communication about what's going on in the project, that we're still here, we're still working on it, we're still dedicated. I think that goes a long way to building that trust.
Unbelievability, right? I think especially people that have been harmed by systems and are underrepresented, rightfully so, don't have a high degree of trust in the majority group really leaning into this conversation. We can even see evidence of that, of what happened the summer of 2020 and the activity around DEI versus now. It's still, I think, a very passionate conversation for folks, but not the same level of passion that was happening last year. So you're so right. Reinforcing, yes, this is still important. Yes, this is what we're doing. And I think people might think, well, people know what we're doing. Well, there's a lot going on in organizations. Being really repetitive about it's probably not a bad thing. So that information sticks and people really see the importance. Because otherwise, even organizations where I can see they've been doing things for years, they'll still have employees like come to the listening session and be like, I don't understand why this is important. Like, oh no. think they really have to hear it that many times to understand it and internalize it. Um, Shanti, shifting gears a little bit and kind of wrapping up our episode, you being of Native American descent, I'm just so curious because now that I think about it, I think of the 150 plus episodes we've had, I don't think we've had a lot of representation from the Native American community, and that shame on me. I need to do better with that. So, listeners, that's a challenge we want to work on. But I'm curious about your perspective, just overall, knowing how generations that have experienced so much. I mean, when I think about Native Americans being just a percentage of our population now, and obviously 100% not so long ago, it's so disheartening. I think to know that about our history. Are there things about the Native American community that you could share, or just for folks that are interested in learning more about how they could be supportive of native land, of tribes? Like, what are some ways you could be an ally to the Native American community?
Thank you for that question. I appreciate it. I think one simple thing that a lot of organizations are doing now is having a land recognition at the beginning of meetings or big events, or maybe on your website, to recognize that the physical place where you are was once Native American land, and that tribe did not give that land to anyone freely. So, for instance, I'm sitting right now in my office on once was Ohlone land, and the Ohlone elders took care of this land and nurtured it for thousands of years before it was taken from them. And the Ohlone people are still here, and they're still a vibrant community, and they're still contributing. So that would be the second way, is to recognize that Native Americans in general, although they're a very diverse group, we come from, more than almost 600 federally recognized tribes. We're a diverse group, and we're still here. I think that sort of gets lost sometimes. We're still here. We're professionals. We're lawyers. We're activists. We're healers. We're teachers. So just to have that awareness, land recognition, awareness, and another way you could be an ally is really to support Native sovereignty as a concept, but as the pipeline issues we've seen in the northern United States and the Dakotas, really like putting either your money, your political will, or your activism, whether that's on social media or something, behind tribes that are asserting their sovereignty, because we are sovereign nations. And that's a very important aspect of being Native, is that idea that we govern ourselves as we should, and as the treaties recognize that we should. And yeah, I guess those are some of the things that people can do. Again, going back to educating yourself,
Yeah.
the Indigenous History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, I think should be absolutely required reading for everyone in the U.S., sort of to rethink our history in the perspective of the people that were and are here.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that land recognition. Going back to your first point, that's a really cool thing to think about. Is know the history of the land you're sitting on and recognize it and have an awareness. Yeah. I think we think, yeah, that the people of Native American descent, of indigenous people, like somehow aren't here anymore. Absolutely are, right? Like you said, and it's not one dimensional. It doesn't mean, you live on a reservation, like you very much could be a part of everyday, everywhere society. And so it's not just this one dimensional look, and a lot of times how we culturally appropriate things. I cringe. Oh my gosh, I cringe when I watch sports teams and their mascots. It's just so disturbing to see white people doing chants that were very much not supported, but then appropriated at that level. So just keeping your ally radar up for those types of behaviors and find ways, like you said, to use your voice, your political collateral, whatever you can do to shape the narrative. And we love that book recommendation. We'll have to link to that in the show notes too, because that is something. Yeah, in Native American history, it's interesting depending on which part of the country you grew up in. I grew up in the Midwest. Not a ton of Native Americans, but in Ohio, there were quite a few. And we at least talked about it, I think, 1 year of elementary school, right? And then I don't think we talked about Native American history much other than like sprinkled in the little bits here and there in the chapter, the history books until college, when I learned about cultural appropriation and learned about some of these issues. So there was a huge void in my understanding and learning, and I suspect much the same for many Americans. So do your education, get to know the real history so that you can help shape the future to be different. Shanti, this has been so fun to talk with you today. Thanks for all the amazing work you're doing. The criminal justice system, I got to be honest, it's one of those things that keeps me up at night as an ally. It just doesn't feel like it's changing fast enough. And thankful for your voice and for the work you do to help shift that change and make that change happen more quickly. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think that is exactly the great way to end this, which is it's not happening fast enough. And that's why we have to keep rededicating ourselves, not only to criminal justice reform and reimagination, but to DEI work in general. I think last summer we had that huge momentum and a huge response to justifiable outrage that really propelled us forward. And my hope is that we can keep paying sustained attention to these issues, because progress is not going to be overnight. It's going to be slow and steady. And that's how we're going to make real change.
Yep, it is. It's a long game, but we're all in it. We're staying in it. Thanks, Shanti. Tell our listeners, how can they follow your work and get to know more about your organization?
Yes, they can go to fogbreakjustice.com to learn about our DEI work with criminal justice professionals, civic organizations, and businesses and organizations. And then my book, Almost Innocent, is available widely on Amazon, for example, or on bookshop.org, which is a way you can support your local bookstores.
Oh, that's great. I know. Yeah, contrary to listeners, what you might be thinking, Amazon does not give you a ton. When you sell books at Amazon, you're not going to get rich usually. So it's nice to have alternatives. We'll be sure to link to that in the show notes as well. Shanti, thank you so much for the great work Fogbreak's doing, for your book, for all of these amazing tools and resources for our listeners. We're thankful for you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you're on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our new signature Lead Like an Ally online self-paced learning program. It's comprehensive, and it includes an online learning platform packed with tools, stories, and ideas to become an even better ally. Head over to leadlikeanally.com to learn more.